Well now, friends, find that comfortable spot once again. Let the noise of the day fade into a gentle hum, and then let that hum fade into silence. Some stories are so absurd, they sound like jokes, and some jokes are so sharp, they reveal a truth that no serious speech ever could. Tonight's story sits in that strange, fascinating space in between. It is a story about a joke so audacious, it became a part of history. A story that proves that sometimes the most serious of times can produce the most surreal of events. As always, it means the world to me to see you here. A simple like or a subscription is a quiet, lovely way to support our journeys together. And I truly do enjoy my morning ritual of reading your comments, seeing where in this wide world you are all settling in to listen from. It makes our little corner of history feel very warm indeed. All right now, let your body grow heavy, let your mind grow light. Let's travel back, not to a distant, dusty century, but to a time well within the memory of our grandparents. A time that feels modern, yet is separated from us by a great chasm of history. The year is 1939, and it is winter in Europe, a cold, sharp winter. Snow dusts the gargoyles of Notre Dame in Paris. A bitter wind blows down the grand avenues of Berlin. The canals of Amsterdam are frozen at their edges. It is a continent wrapped in a blanket of white and a deeper blanket of silence. But it is not a peaceful silence. It is a held breath. The Great War was supposed to have ended all wars, but its ghost still lingers. And another war, a war everyone fears but no one dares to name, had just been narrowly avoided, or so they were told. The crisis in Czechoslovakia, the meeting in Munich, it was all settled. The newspapers print headlines that are just a little too cheerful. The politicians give speeches that are just a little too confident. In the cafes and beer halls, people talk of business, of family, of the weather. But the conversations sometimes stop just for a moment when they see the headline about new factory production, or see a newsreel of soldiers marching in perfect, terrifying unison. They look at the maps in the atlases, at borders that have recently shifted, and a quiet, unspoken question hangs in the cold air. This is not peace. This is a pause. It is the stillness of a forest when a great predator is sensed nearby. The quiet before the avalanche, and in this great, anxious quiet, the world was looking for heroes. They were desperate for a savior, for someone to thank for pulling them back from the brink. And one man, more than any other, was being given the credit for this fragile, trembling calm. That man, the architect of this fragile peace, was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain. He was an unlikely figure for such a dramatic role. An older gentleman, proper and severe, with his neat moustache and his ever-present umbrella, he was the very picture of sober British diplomacy. And in the autumn of 1938, as Adolf Hitler's demands over a region of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland pushed Europe to the very brink of war, Chamberlain decided to do something unprecedented. He flew to Germany, not once, but 3 times. He, the leader of the British Empire, went to meet the German Chancellor to personally negotiate a settlement, to look the man in the eye and find a peaceful solution. To the people of Europe who remembered the horrors of the last Great War, this seemed an act of immense courage and statesmanship, and he returned, apparently victorious. The image is one of the most famous of the 20th century. Chamberlain, stepping off the plane in London, holding aloft a small piece of paper, a simple agreement signed by both him and Hitler. Later, standing outside his residence at 10 Downing Street, he spoke the words that a hopeful world was desperate to hear. He called it peace with honor. And then, the most famous and fateful line of all, "I believe it is peace for our time." The relief across Europe was immense. Crowds cheered him in the streets of London. He was hailed as a hero, a savior, the man who had faced down the spectre of war and won. He had stared into the abyss and brought back peace. But it was a peace bought at a terrible price. The price was Czechoslovakia, a sovereign nation that was carved up and sacrificed without ever being invited to the negotiating table. It was a peace achieved not through strength, but through appeasement, by giving the dictator what he wanted, in the desperate hope that it would be enough. It was a beautiful, hopeful, and tragically flawed idea. And it was this very idea, the idea that Neville Chamberlain was the great peacemaker of his age, that would soon spark one of the strangest and most bitter jokes in political history. In the wake of that triumphant return, it was perhaps inevitable what happened next. The world, it seemed, needed to make its gratitude official. In the final months of 1938 and into the first cold weeks of 1939, letters began to arrive at the Norwegian Nobel Institute in Oslo. They came from members of parliament, from academics, from public figures across Europe, and they all carried the same name, Neville Chamberlain. They nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. The praise was effusive. He was called a hero of diplomacy, a man of courage, the statesman who had single-handedly saved a generation from the horrors of another war. His journey to Munich was framed as a victory for civilization, a triumph of reasonable conversation over the drumbeat of conflict. Looking back now, it is easy to see the deep, tragic naivety in their words. They were celebrating a peace that was already a ghost. They were pinning their hopes on a promise that had been made by a man who had no intention of keeping it. They saw a piece of paper with a signature, and they chose to believe it was a shield that could protect the whole world. It was a beautiful hope, and it was a desperate one. This wave of nominations for Chamberlain was a reflection of the world's desperate desire to believe that the crisis was over, that reason had prevailed, and that they could all go back to their quiet, ordinary lives. They needed a hero for their time, and they had found one in this stern, elderly man with his umbrella and his paper promise of peace. But not everyone was celebrating. Not everyone was convinced. In a quiet, book-lined office in Stockholm, Sweden, a man named Eric Brandt read the morning papers, and he was not celebrating. Brandt was a member of the Swedish Parliament, a man of the Social Democratic Party. He was known as a thoughtful, principled intellectual and a staunch, unwavering anti-fascist. He had watched the rise of Nazism in Germany not with hopeful optimism, but with a growing sense of dread. He understood the nature of the beast. He knew that fascism did not respond to polite conversation and reasonable compromise. It saw such things only as weakness, as an invitation to demand more. And so, as he sat at his desk, the winter light pale on the pages before him, and read the glowing praise for Neville Chamberlain, he did not feel relief. He felt a cold, quiet anger. He saw the Munich Agreement not as a victory for peace, but as a moral catastrophe, a betrayal of a small nation and a dangerous encouragement to a tyrant. To him, awarding the Nobel Peace Prize for this act was not just wrong, it was a perversion of everything the prize was meant to represent. It was like giving a medal for valor to a man who had just handed the keys to the city to an invading army. For a man like Erich Brandt, a man of deep conviction, simply shaking his head in private disapproval was not enough. The world was sleepwalking towards disaster, celebrating a man who had, in Brandt's eyes, tucked the monster into bed and assured everyone it would now be good. He felt a burning need to do something, to shout, to wake the world up from its dangerous, complacent dream. But a simple protest would be ignored. A speech would be forgotten. He needed a different kind of tool, something sharper, something that could cut through the noise and expose the absurdity of the situation for all to see. Let's sit with him in the silence of his study and listen to the storm gathering in his mind. Peace. They call this peace. They stand on balconies and wave a piece of paper, and the crowds cheer for a peace bought with the soul of another nation. A peace that smells of fear and capitulation. They have not averted a war. They have merely delayed it, and in doing so, they have made the aggressor stronger, more confident, more certain of our weakness, and they want to give this man a prize for it. The Nobel Peace Prize. A prize meant for those who build bridges, not for those who dismantle countries. A prize for heroes, not for men who tremble before a bully. They don't understand the man they are dealing with. They think Hitler is a statesman, a politician who can be reasoned with, who can be satisfied. They are wrong. He is not a politician. He is an appetite, a raging fire that sees every concession not as a compromise, but as fresh, dry wood to fuel its own growth. And Chamberlain has just handed him an entire forest to reward this act. To call it peacemaking is to make the world blind. It is to celebrate the delusion. It is to tell every tyrant of the future that if they shout loud enough and threaten enough, the free world will eventually give them what they want, and call it diplomacy. No, this cannot stand. This dangerous absurdity must be exposed. But how? A speech in Parliament. It will be recorded and forgotten. An angry letter to the editor. It will be dismissed as the ramblings of a lone idealist. To fight an absurdity this grand, you need a greater absurdity. You need a mirror so distorted, so shocking, that when they look into it, they are forced to see the ugliness of their own reflection. If they are to give the Peace Prize to the man who appeased the warmonger, then what is the logical conclusion? The truly satirical, the truly honest nomination. And then, in the quiet of his office, an idea of terrible, brilliant simplicity came to him. A thin, sharp, dangerous smile spread across Erich Brandt's face. It was not a smile of happiness. It was the smile of a man who had just crafted the perfect, most outrageous joke. He pushed aside the newspapers. He pulled a fresh, clean sheet of official letterhead towards him. He uncapped his fountain pen, the small click echoing in the silent room. He smoothed the paper, dipped the nib into the dark ink, and began to write to the Norwegian Nobel Committee, and then the subject of his nomination, the answer to his own rhetorical question, the name that would serve as the ultimate mirror to the world's absurdity, the name Adolf Hitler. What Eric Brandt did in that quiet moment was not simply write a name. He chose a weapon, and his weapon was one of the most powerful and most dangerous in all of politics: satire. Satire is a strange and beautiful art. It does not fight an absurdity with facts and figures. It fights an absurdity with a greater absurdity. It is a kind of mirror, but a distorted one. It takes the flaws and delusions of the world and exaggerates them, magnifies them, until they become so large and so ridiculous that they are impossible to ignore. Brandt knew that a serious speech condemning Chamberlain would be dismissed. He knew a protest would be seen as radical noise. The world was too caught up in its hopeful delusion to listen to reason, so he chose not to reason with them. He chose to show them their own reflection in a funhouse mirror. His logic was a kind of political poetry. If the world was going to call Chamberlain a prince of peace for giving a dictator a piece of a neighboring country, then surely the dictator himself, the one who had so graciously accepted this gift without starting a war, yet was an even greater candidate for the prize. By nominating the very source of the world's anxiety, he was exposing the foolishness of celebrating the man who had only appeased it. It was a move of breathtaking audacity, but it was also a dangerous game. For satire to work, the audience must understand the joke. If they don't, if they take the absurdity at face value, then the weapon backfires. The satirist does not become a clever critic. He becomes a monster himself. And Eric Brandt was about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. So he sat there in his quiet office with his audacious, dangerous idea. An idea that could either expose a great folly or destroy his own reputation. He took a deep breath. The room was silent, save for the gentle ticking of a mantelpiece clock and the distant, muffled sounds of Stockholm in winter. He reached for his fountain pen. It was a fine instrument, heavy and cool in his hand. He unscrewed the cap of a small glass bottle of black ink. He dipped the steel nib into the ink, a small, precise, and irreversible action. For a moment the pen hovered over the crisp, white sheet of official parliamentary paper. This was the final moment for doubt, the last chance to turn back. But Eric Brandt did not hesitate. With a steady hand he touched the nib to the paper. The only sound now was the soft, determined scratch of steel on fiber as he began to write. Each letter was formed with care. Each word was chosen with the precision of a surgeon. This was not just a letter. It was a carefully constructed piece of political theatre. He was not just writing words. He was laying a trap made of ink and irony. He knew the language had to be perfect. The praise had to be so over the top, so breathtakingly effusive, that its satirical intent would be clear to any reasonable reader. He filled the page, his pen moving with a steady, quiet rhythm. When he was finished, he read it over one last time, perhaps with that same thin, dangerous smile. He then carefully folded the letter, slid it into a clean envelope, and sealed it with a drop of hot wax. There it sat on his desk, a single, silent object containing a world of trouble. The letter sat on his desk, a silent testament to a decision made. But a letter cannot do its work sitting in an office. It must be sent. It must be released into the world. Eric Brandt put on his heavy winter coat and his hat. He picked up the sealed envelope. It felt impossibly light in his hand, considering the weight of the message it contained. He walked out of the warm, quiet solitude of his study and into the cold, grey air of a Stockholm street. The snow crunched softly under his boots. He walked to a nearby postbox, a simple, red metal container fixed to a wall. He paused for a moment, the letter held in his gloved hand. This was the final point of no return, and with a simple, deliberate motion, he pushed the envelope through the narrow slot. He heard the soft flutter of paper, followed by a dull thud as it landed in the darkness within. The act was done. His joke, his protest, his weapon, was no longer his. It now belonged to the postal system, to the railways and the ships that carried the mail south. It was a message in a bottle, cast into the turbulent political sea of Europe. He had aimed it carefully, but he could no longer control its course, nor the storm it might create when it finally washed ashore in Norway. So what exactly was written in that fateful letter? What masterpiece of political poison did Eric Brandt unleash upon the world? The letter was written with a perfect, deadly sincerity. It began with the standard formal language required for a nomination, respectful and solemn. And then it began its praise. Brandt argued, with a perfectly straight face, that Adolf Hitler was the most deserving candidate for the Peace Prize. He wrote that Hitler was a God-given fighter for peace, and that his book, Mein Kampf, was the greatest work of literature on the subject, second only to the Bible itself. Let's pause to consider that. Mein Kampf, a book filled with racial hatred, with dreams of conquest and domination, praised as a text of peace. The irony was as thick as poison. Brandt went on. He praised Hitler's glowing love for peace and called him the Prince of Peace on Earth. He argued that Hitler, through his bloodless conquests of Austria and the Sudetenland, had shown the world a new way to avoid war. He had pacified Europe without firing a single shot. The entire letter was a masterclass in this kind of twisted logic. Brandt took the very arguments that were being used to praise Chamberlain. The idea of achieving peace by giving a dictator what he wants, and he applied them to Hitler himself. His message was clear. If you were going to celebrate the man who feeds the crocodile, you might as well celebrate the crocodile for eating so peacefully. He wrote without a hint of a smile, without a single wink to the reader. Every word was chosen to mimic the fawning, worshipful tone that so many in Europe were using towards the so-called peacemakers. He had crafted a perfect parody, a trap baited with absurd praise, waiting for the world to step into it. And this letter, this quiet, explosive document, was now on its way to Oslo. I am a letter, a simple, folded piece of paper, sealed in a crisp white envelope. My skin is the finest parliamentary stock. My heart is made of black ink. I do not know the message I carry. I only know the journey. My journey began in the cold darkness of a Stockholm postbox. Then came the rough, gentle hands of a postman, and I was tossed into a great canvas sack with 100 other stories. Love letters, and bills, and notes of condolence. We were all equals in the dark. Then came the rhythm, the steady, rocking, clack-clack-clack of a train, carrying us south through the frozen Swedish countryside. I felt the rumble of the wheels. Through the floor of the mail car, I listened to the muffled sounds of the world rushing by. I was a secret, moving through the night at the coast. I was moved again, this time onto a ship. I could smell the salt and the cold, wet air of the sea, even through the thick canvas of the bag. I felt the slow, deep roll of the waves as we crossed the Skagerrak Strait. I was a message, crossing the water, on my way to a new land, in Norway. The journey continued. Another train, another sorting office, more hands, more sacks. I was carried through the streets of Oslo, a city I could not see. I was simply a passenger, an inert object, unaware of the political dynamite I held within my simple folds. I knew nothing of Chamberlain, or Munich, or the great anxious peace that held Europe in its grip. I knew nothing of the bitter irony that had been so carefully penned onto my pages. My purpose was not to understand. My purpose was simply to arrive, and soon my long journey was coming to its end. Asterisk, asterisk, my journey ended at a stately stone building in Oslo, the home of the Norwegian Nobel Institute. If Erik Brandt's office was a quiet study, this place was a great library. It was a temple dedicated to the highest ideals of humanity. The air inside was hushed, smelling of old paper, floor polish, and the immense, silent weight of history. The walls were lined with books bound in dark leather, volumes on international law, on treaties, on the philosophical pursuit of peace. The portraits of past laureates looked down from the walls, their painted eyes filled with a sober dignity. Here, there was no room for jokes. This was a place of profound seriousness. The men who worked here were scholars, jurists, and former statesmen. Their job, as they saw it, was one of the most important in the world. They were the guardians of Alfred Nobel's grand vision. Their task was to sift through the hopes and politics of the world, to find the one person, the one true hero, who had done the most to further the cause of peace. They approached their work with an almost religious gravity. Each nomination was read, debated, and considered with the utmost care. This was not a task to be taken lightly. The fate of the world, they believed, could be influenced by their choice. Into this sanctuary of reason and idealism I arrived, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a joke dressed in the formal attire of a parliamentary letter. Asterisk, asterisk. Let's imagine a clerk at the Institute, an elderly man, perhaps, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. For weeks, his desk has been piled high with letters just like me. His job is to open, to read, to verify, and to file. It is a quiet, methodical, and respectable job. He picks up a silver letter opener. He slits the top of an envelope from a British lord nominating Chamberlain. He scans it, nods, and places it on a neat pile. He picks up another from a French academic, also nominating Chamberlain. He places it on the same pile. The work is predictable. It is noble. Then his hand settles on me. An envelope from Stockholm, Sweden, from a parliamentarian named Erik G.C. Brandt. The clerk assumes it is just another letter of support for the British Prime Minister. He slits my top with practiced ease. He unfolds the paper held within. His eyes, accustomed to the language of formal praise, begin to scan the first few lines. To the Norwegian Nobel Committee, I hereby humbly suggest that the Nobel Peace Prize for 1939 is awarded to. He nods, his mind already reaching for the next envelope, and then he reads the name. Asterisk, asterisk, the clerk, this quiet man of ledgers and routine, simply stared at the name on the page. Adolf Hitler, his mind, for a moment, refused to process it. He took off his spectacles. He carefully polished the lenses with a small, clean handkerchief. He placed them back on his nose, leaning closer to the paper, as if a clearer view might change the words themselves, but the name was still there. Stark, black, impossible. His first thought was that it must be a prank, a forgery. He ran a practiced finger over the letterhead. It was authentic. The embossed seal of the Swedish Parliament was correct. He squinted at the signature. It appeared to be the legitimate signature of Erik Brandt, a man whose name he recognized. His orderly world began to tilt. Nothing in his decades of service had prepared him for this. He forced himself to read on, past the name, into the body of the letter. He read the praise for Mein Kampf. He read the phrase, Prince of Peace on Earth. And as he read, his initial shock slowly, very slowly, began to transform. A flicker of something new appeared in his old eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was a kind of reluctant, astonished understanding. He saw the trap. He saw the savage, brilliant irony. This was not a serious nomination. This was a protest. A joke so sharp and so profound it bordered on genius. A dry, quiet chuckle might have escaped his lips there in the silent, hallowed halls of the Nobel Institute. He was the first person to get the joke, and he was the first person to realize the terrible, awkward problem it was about to create. The old clerk now faced a dilemma that was both bureaucratic and philosophical. He understood the joke. He saw the sharp, satirical intent behind the letter. His personal, human reaction was one of astonished admiration. But he was not just a man. He was a servant of an institution, and institutions run on rules, not on an appreciation for irony. The Nobel Peace Prize was not governed by taste or common sense. It was governed by the last will and testament of Alfred Nobel, a legal document with a very specific set of statutes. These statutes laid out exactly who was qualified to submit a nomination. The list was exclusive: members of national governments and parliaments, previous laureates, certain university professors, and so on. It was a system designed to ensure that only serious nominations from serious people would ever be considered. And here was the problem. Erik G.C. Brandt was, without question, a sitting member of the Swedish Parliament. He was, according to the Foundation's own rules, a perfectly valid no minator. Therefore, his nomination, no matter how outrageous, how offensive, or how clearly satirical, was technically legitimate. The committee had no mechanism to reject a nomination based on its content if the nominator was qualified. They couldn't simply throw it in the rubbish bin and pretend it never arrived. To do so would be to break their own sacred rules. It was a perfect, beautiful trap. The very system designed to ensure dignity and seriousness was now forced, by its own rigid logic, to process a nomination that was a mockery of everything it stood for. The institution, in its quest for order, had no defense against this particular brand of chaos, and so the old clerk, after a long, weary sigh, knew what he had to do. His personal feelings did not matter. The rules were the rules. He picked up his pen, dipped it in the ink, and opened the great, heavy ledger where all the official nominations for 1939 were to be recorded. With a hand that was steady from a lifetime of clerical duty, the old clerk wrote the name in the ledger. There it was, in crisp, black ink, now a permanent part of the official record for the 1939 Nobel Peace Prize. A Hitler. The name sat there. On the page, surrounded by the respectable names of statesmen and humanitarians, looking utterly, shockingly out of place. He then took the original letter from Brandt, folded it neatly, and placed it inside a simple manila folder. On the tab, he wrote the name of the nominee. He rose from his chair, walked across the quiet room to a tall, dark wood filing cabinet, and pulled open a heavy drawer. It was filled with the hopes of the world. Dozens of other folders, each containing a prayer for peace, a nomination for a person believed to be a force for good, and among them, the clerk slid this new file. He was not filing a piece of paper. He was arming a bomb made of satire, with a fuse of political outrage, waiting for a spark. He pushed the drawer closed. It shut with a soft, final click. The lock was turned. The secret was now hidden away, buried in the heart of the world's most dignified institution. It sat there in the darkness, a quiet, ticking thing, waiting for the right journalist, the right leak, the right moment of public curiosity to detonate. For now, all was quiet. The clerk returned to his desk and picked up the next letter. But the peace of the room felt different now. It was no longer the peace of scholarly work. It was the tense, heavy silence of a secret being kept. Asterisk, asterisk, and so, for a short while, the world kept turning, unaware of the strange joke sleeping in the Nobel archives. The secret was kept. The bomb did not detonate. In London, Neville Chamberlain likely read the papers praising his diplomatic triumph and felt a sense of satisfaction. He was the man of peace, the man who had saved the world. He had no idea that his name was now resting in the same pile as that of the very man he believed he had tamed in Berlin. Adolf Hitler was likely poring over military maps, his mind not on peace prizes, but on his next move, his next demand. He was utterly unaware of the strange, unsolicited honor that had been bestowed upon him by a Swedish socialist he had never met, and in Stockholm, Eric Brandt went about his daily duties as a parliamentarian. He would pass his colleagues in the halls, the same colleagues who had nominated Chamberlain, and perhaps he would offer a polite nod, a small, secret smile playing on his lips. No one knew what he had done. He had fired his satirical arrow, and now all he could do was wait to see where it landed. For a few precious days in January of 1939, the continent of Europe continued its nervous, fragile dance. A dance of denial, of wishful thinking, of trying desperately to believe in a peace that was already a ghost. All while a fuse was quietly burning in a filing cabinet in Norway. Asterisk, asterisk, but secrets, especially secrets as delicious and scandalous as this one, have a very short lifespan in the world of politics and journalism. It began, as these things often do, as a whisper, a fragment of a rumor overheard in a smoky Stockholm cafe, where political aides and reporters gathered to trade gossip. Someone who knew someone at the Nobel Institute had mentioned something about a nomination so strange, so shocking, that the committee was at a loss for what to do. Most dismissed it as fantasy. But one journalist, a man with a nose for a good story, felt a prickle of interest. The rumor was tied to the name Eric Brandt, the fiery It didn't quite make sense, which is precisely what made it so intriguing. He began to dig. A quiet phone call here, a carefully worded question to a source in Parliament there, and then he got his confirmation. An anonymous source, perhaps a clerk horrified by the secret, or a politician amused by it, confirmed the unbelievable truth. The journalist had his story. A story so absurd, so explosive, that he knew it would be on the front page of every newspaper in Europe. He rushed back to his office. The fuse on the ticking time bomb had just been lit. The quiet was about to end. Asterisk, asterisk, the next morning. The secret was a secret no more. It landed on the doorsteps and breakfast tables of Europe with the heavy thud of the morning paper. And there it was, in bold, black, undeniable ink. The headline, or a version of it, was the same in Stockholm, in London, in Paris. Adolf Hitler nominated for Nobel Peace Prize. Imagine the scene. A man in a cafe, lifting his coffee cup to his lips, freezes, his eyes fixed on the page. A woman on a tram reads the headline over a stranger's shoulder and lets out an audible gasp. The first reaction, everywhere, was the same. Disbelief. It had to be a mistake, a misprint, a fabrication. People read the headline once, then twice, then a third time, as if looking at it longer might change the words. But it was no mistake. The story was there, with the details. The nominator, Erik Brandt, a member of the Swedish Parliament. The formal letter, the confirmation from sources close to the Nobel Committee. The joke, intended for a small circle of political insiders, had escaped its cage. It was no longer a piece of sharp satire. It was now a cold, hard, public fact. And the disbelief of the morning quickly hardened into a wave of confusion and outrage that began to sweep across the continent. Asterisk, asterisk. The wave of public shock quickly became a political tsunami. In the foreign ministries of London and Paris, the telephones began to ring. Ambassadors demanded explanations from their Swedish counterparts. In the parliaments, politicians who had proudly nominated Chamberlain now scrambled to distance themselves from a prize that had been tainted by association. The problem was that the joke was too clever. In the tense, anxious atmosphere of 1939, there was no room for subtlety. The public, reading the news, did not see the sharp satire. They saw the unthinkable. The name of the world's most dangerous man, formally nominated for the world's most prestigious prize for peace. The reaction was not a wry chuckle of understanding. It was a roar of outrage. Letters flooded the offices of newspapers, denouncing the nomination as an insult to civilization. Small crowds gathered outside Swedish embassies in protest. Erik Brandt, in their eyes, was not a clever satirist. He was a madman, or worse, a secret fascist sympathizer who had shown his true colors. The delicate, intellectual weapon he had forged had been completely misunderstood. It had been taken literally, and the world was horrified. The scandal was no longer about the foolishness of appeasing Hitler. It was now about the audacity of seeming to praise him. The original target of Brandt's joke, the nomination of Neville Chamberlain, was almost entirely forgotten in the firestorm. All anyone could talk about, all anyone could think about, was the single, shocking, sacrilegious idea that Adolf Hitler's name was now officially in the running for the Nobel Peace Prize. The joke was now on its creator. Let's return now to that quiet, book-lined office in Stockholm. It is no longer quiet. It is the eye of a hurricane of his own making. The telephone on Erik Brandt's desk rings incessantly. It is the leader of his party, his voice a low, furious growl on the other end of the line, demanding an explanation. It is a fellow parliamentarian, screaming his outrage. It is a journalist, trying to trick him into a quote. His desk is buried under a mountain of telegrams and letters. They are not letters of support. They are letters of hate, of confusion, of condemnation, from all across Sweden and Europe. They call him a traitor, a fool, a Nazi sympathizer. They accuse him of dragging the good name of their country, and of the Nobel Prize itself, through the mud. He is a man under siege. He had intended his letter to be a sharp, surgical strike against the world's complacency, a clever bomb of irony designed to be understood by his intellectual and political peers. He expected them to see the joke, to quietly appreciate his audacity, and perhaps to feel a prick of shame about their own eagerness to praise Chamberlain. he had miscalculated. Badly he had underestimated the power of public opinion and its deep intolerance for nuance in a time of fear. His subtle, layered joke had been flattened into a single, monstrous headline. He had wanted to hold up a mirror, but the world, it seemed, had smashed the mirror and was now trying to stone him with the broken pieces. He was utterly, completely alone. Asterisk, asterisk, trapped in the storm he had created. Eric Brandt tried to explain. He wrote letters. He gave statements to the press. He tried to lay out the intricate, intellectual logic of his satirical protest. His argument was clear. He explained that he was, in fact, one of Europe's staunchest anti-fascists. He explained that his nomination of Hitler was meant as a sharp rebuke to the nomination of Neville Chamberlain. He wanted to show the world that appeasing a dictator was not an act of peace, but an act of surrender, and that rewarding it with a Nobel Prize was a dangerous folly. His nomination, he insisted, was irony, a protest, a joke, but the world was not in a laughing mood. He was trying to explain the intricate mechanics of a clock, but all anyone could hear was the ticking of a bomb. The public did not care for his nuanced arguments about political satire. Their reaction was far more simple, more primal. He had written the name Adolf Hitler on a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. He had placed the name of a monster next to the name of a sacred honor. For them, the context did not matter. The intent did not matter. The act itself was a desecration. His explanation was a complex, whispered argument in a room where everyone else was shouting. The more he tried to explain the joke, the more he sounded like a madman trying to justify an unforgivable act. His intellectual weapon had completely misfired. He had aimed for the powerful, but had instead hit the public's deepest fears and sensitivities. The protest was lost. Only the scandal remained. Asterisk, asterisk, and what of the original target of Brandt's satire? What of Neville Chamberlain, the man whose nomination had sparked this whole affair? From London there came a profound and telling silence, in a supreme and beautiful irony, Brandt's joke, while a public relations disaster for himself, had perfectly achieved its primary goal. It had made the nomination of Neville Chamberlain for the Nobel Peace Prize look utterly ridiculous. How could the committee seriously consider giving the prize to the man who appeased Hitler, when Hitler himself was now on the very same list? The association was toxic. The whole affair had become a political embarrassment. And so, the very same politicians and newspapers that had been singing Chamberlain's praises just weeks before, now fell silent. There were no more grand editorials, no more speeches about peace for our time. The best thing to do, they all silently agreed, was to let the matter fade away as quietly as possible. Silence, in politics, is rarely empty. It is a language all its own. And this silence was a clear admission of defeat. They could not defend Chamberlain's prize without looking like fools. Brandt had not attacked them directly. He had simply poisoned the well. He had made the 1939 Nobel Peace Prize so controversial that no one could receive it without being stained by the scandal, in failing so spectacularly to make the world understand his joke. Eric Brandt had, in a strange way, completely succeeded. Asterisk, asterisk, and what of Berlin? What was the reaction in the cold, marble heart of the Third Reich? It's unlikely that the news was met with laughter. Irony, especially irony aimed at the Führer, was not a language the Nazi regime understood or tolerated. 1. Can imagine the report landing on the desk of Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. He would have read it, first with disbelief, and then with a surge of fury. To him and to Hitler, this would not have been seen as a clever protest against Chamberlain. It would have been seen as a direct insult, a decadent Jewish Bolshevik plot, as they might have framed it, to mock the dignity of the German Reich and its leader in the grand, humorless theater of Nazi Germany. There was no room for such complicated jokes. Everything was seen through a lens of power, of respect, of friend and foe. A nomination from a known anti-fascist could only be an act of aggression. Or perhaps they saw it a different way. Perhaps they saw it as a sign of the West's utter confusion and moral decay, a sign that the democracies were so weak, so decadent, that they had lost their minds completely, ironically nominating their greatest adversary for a prize for peace. Perhaps, in some small way, it even pleased them. It was proof that their psychological warfare was working. It was evidence that the world was tying itself in knots, unable to comprehend the force that was rising in their midst. We will never know for sure what Hitler himself thought of the nomination, but given his personality, his complete lack of humor about himself, and his profound hatred for international institutions he could not control, it is safe to assume he was not amused. He did not see a joke, he saw an insult, and insults were something he never forgot. Asterisk, asterisk, while the world raged. The 5 members of the Norwegian Nobel Committee sat in their quiet, wood-panelled room in Oslo, facing an impossible dilemma. Let's imagine the chairman staring at the letter from Erik Brandt. He is a man of immense dignity, a jurist who has dedicated his life to the ideals of peace and international law. And this single piece of paper is an affront to everything he believes in. His every instinct tells him to take the letter, to throw it into the fire, and to pretend it never existed. To do so would be to protect the honor of the prize, to shield it from this bizarre, cynical mockery, but he cannot. He is bound by the will of Alfred Nobel. He is a servant of the rules, and the rules are perfectly, maddeningly clear. The nomination is valid. The nominator is qualified. He and his committee have no right to discard it. To do so would be to set a dangerous precedent, to suggest that the committee could be swayed by public outrage or political pressure. The integrity of the process, the very thing that gave the prize its weight, would be compromised. They were trapped by their own integrity. The press was hounding them for a statement. Foreign governments were sending discreet, worried inquiries, and on their table sat a nomination for Adolf Hitler, a document they were legally obligated to process. They were the guardians of the world's most hopeful prize, and they were now forced to be the unwilling archivists of its most cynical joke. The situation was absurd, unprecedented, and deeply, deeply uncomfortable. An idea, once it is released into the world, no longer belongs to its creator. It takes on a life of its own. And Erik Brandt's satirical idea, born in the quiet of his study, was now a rampaging monster, and he had lost all control of it. The engine of this monster was the modern media of 1939. The newspapers, the radio broadcasts, the telegraph wires that buzzed with news across the continent. They were not interested in the subtle, intellectual layers of Brandt's protest. They were interested in a headline, a single, shocking sentence that could be printed in big, black letters. And they had one. The story was transformed. It was stripped of all its irony, all its context, all its purpose. The nuanced political critique became a blunt, sensational fact. It was a game of telephone on a global scale. Brandt had whispered a complex, satirical poem into the receiver. But by the time it came out the other end, all that was left was a single, shouted, horrifying word. Hitler. This is the power and the danger of public discourse. It has very little patience for complexity, especially in times of great fear. The public needed a simple story with a clear villain, and since Hitler was already the ultimate villain, the story became about the man who had dared to praise him. Eric Brandt had wanted to use satire to force the world to think more deeply. Instead, he had simply given them something new to be angry about. His clever joke had become a public relations nightmare, an international scandal, and a diplomatic headache for his country and for the Nobel Committee. He had launched his arrow, expecting it to hit a specific target, but the arrow was now tumbling wildly through the air, and he could do nothing but watch in horror as it threatened to bring the whole sky down. Eric Brandt, the idealist, the satirist, finally had to face a difficult truth. His joke had failed. He had intended it as a scalpel to cut away the tumor of political delusion. But in the clumsy hands of the world, it had become a blunt instrument, doing more harm than good. His protest was not being heard. His message was lost. All that remained was the scandal. And he realized, sitting there amidst the ringing phone and the angry letters, that his clever protest was now actively damaging the very cause he believed in. It was sowing confusion among anti-allies. It was making a mockery of an institution he respected. It was distracting from the real and growing danger in Berlin. He had wanted to wound a monster, but instead he had wounded his friends, and so, with the heavy heart of a man who sees his brilliant plan has gone terribly wrong, he knew what he had to do. He could not explain the joke. He could not control it. He could only end it. He had to kill his own creation. He had to withdraw the nomination. It was a personal defeat, an admission that his sharp wit was no match for the world's blunt fear. But it was the only responsible move left to him. Once more, Eric Brandt sat down at his desk. Once more, he pulled a clean sheet of parliamentary letterhead towards him. Once more, he uncapped his fountain pen, but the atmosphere in the room was entirely different. The fire of intellectual mischief was gone. The sharp, satirical smile was gone. All that remained was a heavy sense of duty and the bitter taste of a lesson learned too late. This second letter was not a work of art. It was an act of surrender. His hand, which had once danced across the page with such audacious flair, now moved with a slow, weary precision. The words he wrote were not elaborate or poetic. They were short, formal, direct. He stated, in no uncertain terms, that his nomination of Adolf Hitler was never intended to be taken seriously. He explained that it was a satirical critique of the political climate and of the nomination of Neville Chamberlain, and seeing that his satirical intent had been so thoroughly misunderstood by the public, causing a scandal he did not foresee, he was, with immediate effect, officially withdrawing the nomination. There were no more jokes, no more irony. The letter was an apology and a retraction, all in one. He folded it, sealed it, and sent it on the same journey as the first. If the first letter was a firecracker, tossed into a crowded room to cause a commotion, this second letter was a bucket of cold water aimed at dousing the very flames he had started. The joke was over. Now only the clean-up remained. Brandt's second letter did its job. The news of the withdrawal was reported. The public outrage, having been given a resolution, slowly subsided. The political storm passed. It seemed, for a moment, that the bizarre affair was finally over. But history does not work that way. You can withdraw a nomination, but you cannot unwrite a letter. You cannot erase a fact. Back in the quiet, wood-paneled halls of the Nobel Institute, the process of history was being made permanent. The second letter was placed inside the same manila folder as the first. Then, an archivist took a heavy rubber stamp and a pad of dark ink. With a firm final motion, he stamped the word withdrawn across the file. The nomination was cancelled. But it was not destroyed. It was not erased. It remains there in the Nobel archives in Oslo to this very day. A curious, strange, and unsettling file sitting forever amongst the nominations for the world's greatest heroes. It is a permanent record of a joke that went too far, a scar on the skin of history. The wound has closed, but the mark is there for anyone to see, a faint, curious reminder of a moment when the world, just for a moment, seemed to lose its mind. The story was over, but it was now immortal. Asterisk, it is one of history's greatest ironies, that Adolf Hitler's name should be forever preserved in the archives of an institution he so thoroughly despised. His disdain for the Nobel Prize was not a secret. In fact, by 1939, he had already declared a personal war on it. To understand this, we must go back a few years. To 1936. That year, the Norwegian Nobel Committee made one of the bravest and most politically charged decisions in its history. They awarded the 1935 Nobel Peace Prize, which had been reserved, to a man named Karl von Ossietzky. Ossietzky was a German journalist, a pacifist, and one of the most vocal internal critics of the Nazi regime. He had exposed Germany's secret rearmament, a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. For this act of telling the truth, he had been arrested and was, at that very moment, wasting away in a Nazi concentration camp by awarding the prize to a political prisoner. The Nobel Committee was sending a clear, unambiguous message to the world. They were condemning the actions of the Third Reich. It was a stunning rebuke. Hitler was enraged. He saw the prize not as an honor for a brave man, but as a direct attack on his government, an intolerable interference in Germany's internal affairs. He forbade Ossietzky from traveling to Norway to accept the award. And then he went further. In 1937, he issued a decree. From that day forward, no German citizen, ever, in any field, be it physics, chemistry, or peace, would be allowed to accept a Nobel Prize. It was, he declared, an insult to German honor. So let's consider the magnificent, layered absurdity of the situation in 1939. An anti-fascist in Sweden, to protest the appeasement of Hitler, had nominated Hitler himself for a prize that Hitler had already furiously banned his own people from ever receiving. The joke was more complex and more perfect than even Eric Brandt might have realized. A leader who forbids his people from accepting the world's most prestigious prize must, of course, offer them something else. Something, in his eyes, far superior. And so, in the wake of his ban on the Nobel Prize, Hitler created his own alternative. It was called the German National Prize for Art and Science. It was designed to be the Third Reich's answer to Stockholm and Oslo. It was a statement of cultural and intellectual independence. The message was clear. Germany did not need the approval of a foreign committee made up of liberals and internationalists. Germany would recognize its own greatness, and the prize itself was a perfect reflection of Nazi aesthetics, where the Nobel medal was an object of sober, classical beauty. The German National Prize was a grandiose affair. It was an ornate, star-shaped medallion decorated with eagles and swastikas. and it came with a very handsome sum of 100,000 Reichsmarks. But most telling of all were the recipients. The prize was awarded to the architects who designed Hitler's monumental buildings. Like Albert Speer, it was awarded to the engineers who designed his weapons and his cars. Like Ferdinand, Porsche, and Wilhelm Messerschmitt, while the Nobel Committee was awarding prizes to pacifists and humanitarians, Hitler was awarding prizes to the very men who were building his war machine. The irony is almost too perfect. In the very years that the world was debating whether Hitler's appeasers deserved a prize for peace, Hitler himself was busy giving prizes for contributions to German power. It shows the vast, unbridgeable gulf between the reality in Berlin and the wishful thinking in the rest of Europe. They were not even speaking the same language of value. Asterisk, but the story of strange Nobel nominations in this era does not end with Hitler. To fully understand the bizarre political climate that Erich Brandt was protesting, we must mention another name that found its way onto the esteemed list. Benito Mussolini, yes, Il Duce, the fascist dictator of Italy, Hitler's closest ally, was also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He was nominated in 1935. The very same year, the prize was eventually awarded to Karl von Ossietzky, the anti-fascist writer imprisoned by the Nazis. The irony is breathtaking. In the same year, the Nobel Committee had to seriously consider both a primary architect of European fascism and one of its most prominent victims. Mussolini's nomination wasn't a joke. It was submitted in earnest by a German law professor and several academics in Italy. Their reasoning, from their point of view, was based on his role a decade earlier in the Locarno Treaties, an agreement that was, at the time, seen as a great hope for securing peace in Europe after the First World War. This event, perhaps even more than Brandt's satirical letter, reveals the deep confusion and moral contradictions of the time. It shows that there were intelligent, educated people who were willing to overlook the brutality and tyranny of a fascist regime in the name of a perceived stability. It shows that Erich Brandt was not just mocking a single nomination of Chamberlain. He was mocking an entire political mindset. A mindset that was dangerously willing to mistake the silence of submission for the quiet of peace. Asterisk, let's pause and remember the date on Erich Brandt's letter, January 1939. All of this, the arguments, the scandal, the headlines, the fury over a satirical joke, it was all happening while a clock was ticking, a clock that no one seemed to hear. February passed. March came, and Hitler, in direct violation of the Munich Agreement, invaded and dismantled the rest of Czechoslovakia. The last illusions of peace for our time were shattered. The spring turned to a tense, anxious summer, and then, on the 1st of September 1939, just 8 months after Erich Brandt nominated Adolf Hitler for the Nobel Peace Prize, German tanks rolled across the border into Poland. The Second World War had begun. The great, abstract debates about peace and honor were over. The time for jokes, however clever, was over. The real world, in all its brutality and horror, had finally arrived. And the name that had been a shocking, absurd suggestion on a piece of paper was now a name that would be written in blood across the entire continent. Asterisk, and in that terrible moment, as the first shots of the Second World War were fired, Erich Brandt's bizarre joke was transformed. It was no longer a joke at all. It had become a dark and terrible prophecy. His satirical point, which had been lost in the noise of public outrage, was now terrifyingly clear. He had tried to warn them that the Peace of Munich was a sham, a dangerous illusion that would only make the aggressor bolder. History now proved him right. He had ironically nominated Hitler, the Prince of Peace, for his bloodless conquests, hinting that this was only a temporary state, a pause before a greater violence. History now proved him right. His nomination was a protest against the world's naive refusal to see the man in Berlin for what he truly was. And now, the man in Berlin had shown his true face to the world, and it was the face of a conqueror. The great satirist is often a kind of prophet. By taking the absurdities of the present and pushing them to their logical conclusion, they show us a glimpse of a future we are too afraid to see for ourselves. Eric Brandt had held up a distorted mirror to the face of Europe, and the reflection it showed was so ugly and so frightening that most people had refused to look. Now, they could not look away. There could have been no satisfaction for him in this vindication, no joy in being proven right in the most catastrophic way imaginable. His protest, once dismissed as a foolish prank, was now revealed to be one of the clearest and most prescient political statements of its time. He had understood the truth, and the truth was war. And what became of the prize itself? The 1939 Nobel Peace Prize, the award at the center of this storm of satire and scandal. In the autumn of that year, as armies marched across Europe, the 5 members of the Nobel Committee met in Oslo. The world they had known just months before was gone. The peace they were meant to celebrate had been exposed as a fragile illusion. They looked at their list of nominees. There was Neville Chamberlain, a man whose legacy was now one of tragic failure, and in their files there was the withdrawn, but unforgettable nomination for Adolf Hitler. How could they possibly award a prize for peace in a year that had seen the beginning of the world's most devastating war? To give it to Chamberlain would have been a cruel joke, a mockery far greater than anything Eric Brandt had intended. To give it to anyone else would have felt hollow, a trivial gesture in the face of such overwhelming violence. And so, they made the only decision they could. For the year 1939, no Nobel Peace Prize was awarded. It was a quiet, solemn admission of the truth. There was no peace to be found, and there would be no Peace Prize the next year, in 1940, nor the year after that, nor for the 2 years after that. For 5 long, brutal years, as the world tore itself apart, the prize for peace fell silent. It was a silence that spoke louder than any award ever could. And so, the story of the 1939 nomination simply ends. It was a strange, brief, and furious little storm, but it was soon swallowed by the great hurricane of the war itself. In the vast, terrible history of the Second World War, a history written in fire and blood and millions of lost lives, the story of Eric Brandt's satirical letter is little more than a curious footnote, a bizarre anecdote, a piece of historical trivia, a sad, strange little tale about a joke that was too clever for a world that was on the brink of madness. But sometimes, the smallest footnotes tell the biggest stories. They can reveal the mood of a time, the fears and follies of an age, more clearly than any grand headline. And this story, it is a perfect, tiny mirror reflecting the face of Europe in 1939, confused, frightened, desperate to believe in an easy peace, and utterly blind to the catastrophe that was about to unfold. So let us look, one last time, into that strange little mirror that this story holds up to the world. What does it show us? It shows us that the world of politics is often a world of profound and bewildering contradictions. It was a time when the act of giving away a piece of a sovereign nation was celebrated as an act of peace. A time when a satirical letter of protest was mistaken for a genuine endorsement of tyranny. A time when a man of principle was branded a fool, and a man of peace was nominated alongside a man of war. This story pulls back the curtain on the grand theatre of diplomacy. It shows us that beneath the confident speeches and the formal agreements, there is often a current of fear, of wishful thinking, and of a desperate desire to avoid difficult truths. It reminds us that history is rarely a simple story of good versus evil. More often, it is a complicated story of good intentions leading to terrible outcomes, and strange, misguided actions sometimes revealing a deeper truth. It is a story about the gap between perception and reality. The world perceived Chamberlain as a hero, while the reality was that his actions only emboldened his adversary. The world perceived Brandt as a traitor, while the reality was that his analysis of the situation was terrifyingly correct. And it reminds us that public discourse, especially in times of great anxiety, is a blunt instrument. It does not have time for irony or nuance. It searches for simple narratives, for clear heroes and villains, and it often gets them wrong. This strange little footnote from 1939 is not just a story about the past. It is a timeless lesson about the complex, confusing, and often deeply absurd nature of the world we all live in. This whole strange affair revolves around a single, beautiful, and complicated word: peace. The Nobel Prize for it, the negotiations for it, the praise for it. But what does it actually mean? We often think of peace as a simple thing. It is the absence of war, the silence of guns, the end of a conflict. By this simple measure, what Neville Chamberlain did in Munich could, for a brief moment, be called peace. He had stopped the immediate march to war. But this story, this strange satirical footnote, reminds us that true peace is so much more than that. True peace is not just the absence of something bad. It must also be the presence of something good. It is not just the silence of guns. It is the presence of justice. The Peace of Munich was a quiet born of injustice. It was the silence of a small nation being sacrificed on the altar of a larger nation's fear. It was a peace that required the victim to be silent so that the powerful would not be disturbed. And a peace built on such a rotten foundation cannot last. It is a house built on sand. Eric Brandt understood this. His outrageous joke was not a protest against peace. It was a protest against a false peace. He was arguing, in the only way he felt he could be heard, that you cannot honor the act of appeasing injustice and call it peacemaking. The story of 1939 is a timeless lesson that true, lasting peace is never easy. It is noisy. It is difficult. It requires courage, not just compromise. It requires standing up for justice, not just hoping for quiet. And so we come back to the man who started it all, Eric Brandt. The man with his pen, his principles, and his sharp, dangerous sense of humor. In the end, his joke was misunderstood. His protest was clumsy. It caused a scandal that hurt his own reputation. By most conventional measures, his plan was a failure, but was it? Sometimes the most powerful truths cannot be spoken in a serious voice. When a king is wearing no clothes, sometimes it is only the jester who is brave enough to point it out. And in 1939, the Emperor of European diplomacy was proudly parading his new clothes of peace for our time. And Eric Brandt was the jester, who dared to shout that the man was, in fact, naked. His weapon was not a spear or a sword. His weapon was ridicule, and it is a powerful weapon indeed. His nomination of Hitler in its spectacular failure to be understood, succeeded in another way. It created a permanent, indelible stain on the legacy of appeasement. It created a historical record so absurd, so bizarre, that it forces all future generations to stop and to question what was really happening in that fearful winter. It took courage to do what he did, the courage to be misunderstood, the courage to risk his career, the courage to use a strange and unpredictable weapon in the defense of a principle. He may not have been celebrated as a hero at the time, but history, with its long and patient view, can now see his act for what it was: a desperate, brilliant, and ultimately correct protest against a world that had lost its way. Asterisk. And while Brandt's nomination of Hitler is perhaps the most bizarre and shocking in the Nobel's long history, it is far from the only controversial one. The story of the Peace Prize is littered with strange political calculations and surprising names. Did you know, for example, that Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator responsible for the deaths of millions of his own people, was nominated for the prize not once, but twice, in 1945 and 1948, for his efforts in ending the Second World War? And on the other side of the coin, Mahatma Gandhi, perhaps the world's most famous icon of non-violent resistance, was nominated 5 times but never once won the prize. A fact that the Nobel Committee itself has publicly regretted. The history of the prize is a mirror of the world's messy politics. It is a human institution, and therefore it is full of human complexities and contradictions. It has been used as a political weapon, as a statement of protest, and as a tool of diplomacy. And so, Eric Brandt's satirical nomination, in its own strange way, fits into this long tradition of controversy. It serves as a powerful reminder that the path to peace is never simple, and the people nominated to represent it are often a reflection of the complicated and deeply flawed world they inhabit. The nomination of Adolf Hitler was not an anomaly in a perfect system. It was an extreme symptom of a system wrestling with a world on the brink of chaos. So let us return, one last time, to that cold, anxious winter of 1939. Let's stand in the quiet streets and watch the world go by. But this time, let's watch it with the sad wisdom of knowing what comes next. We see the children building snowmen in the parks of Paris, unaware that their playgrounds would soon be the domain of foreign soldiers. We see the families in London, gathered around their radios, listening to cheerful music and trying to believe the headlines that promised peace, unaware of the nights of blackout and air raid sirens that were waiting for them. We see the politicians in their warm, wood-paneled offices, debating the fallout from a satirical letter, a tiny storm in a teacup, unaware of the firestorm that was about to consume the entire continent. Knowing what we know now, the entire affair of Hitler's nomination seems so small, so trivial, so incredibly absurd. It was the last, strange, nervous tick of a world that was about to have a seizure. It was a final farcical play performed on a stage that was already beginning to tremble from the marching of armies just over the horizon. It is a deeply sad picture. A world going about its business, trying desperately to believe in normalcy, to hold on to the fragile quiet, while the ground beneath its feet was already beginning to crumble. They were standing on the very edge of the abyss, and they were arguing about a joke. And soon there would be no more room for laughter. Asterisk, that world of 1939 is gone now, a ghost in a history book. But the story leaves behind an echo, and if we listen closely, we can hear that echo in our own time. History rarely repeats itself exactly, but its patterns often rhyme. And the pattern of 1939 is a timeless one. It is the story of the seductive appeal of an easy peace, the temptation to accept a comforting lie over a difficult truth. We still live in a world of complex problems, and we are still offered simple, confident solutions. We are still asked to believe that if we just give a little here, or look away a little there, that the great troubles of the world will simply leave us alone. The story of Eric Brandt's strange nomination is a quiet but powerful reminder to be wary of such easy promises. It reminds us that true peace is rarely quiet, and that the silence of appeasement is often just the sound of a future conflict drawing a deep breath. It reminds us to value the difficult, sometimes annoying, voice of the dissenter, the person who stands up in a cheering crowd and dares to ask, "But is this really true? Is this really right?" That question is sometimes the most important act of peacemaking there is. It is a heavy thought, perhaps, but it is the final, quiet gift of this strange, sad, and deeply human story. But those are heavy thoughts, and the night is not for heavy thoughts. It is a time for letting go. So let the story of that anxious winter fade away now. Let the angry headlines soften into a gentle rustle of paper. Let the frantic ringing of telephones in Stockholm fall completely silent. Let the whispers in the cafes dissolve into the quiet of this room. The story has been told. It rests now, a strange and sad footnote, sleeping peacefully in the dusty archives of history. There is no more outrage. There is no more irony. There is only silence. And in that silence, we can begin to find our own rest. Let all the noise of the past grow distant, until the only thing you can hear is the soft, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Let's just rest here for a moment, in that deep, comfortable quiet. Imagine that archive in Oslo, late at night. The great building is silent. Moonlight streams in through a tall, arched window, illuminating the soft, slow dance of dust motes in the air. The room is filled with endless rows of tall, dark wooden shelves, and on those shelves sit the countless stories of history, treaties and declarations, and the private letters of kings. Each one is a sleeping story, its noisy, passionate life now contained within the quiet of its folder. There is no sound here, except perhaps the gentle creak of old wood settling, or the faint, distant ticking of a great clock, patiently marking the peaceful passage of the night. It smells of old paper and leather and time itself, and somewhere in that vast, quiet library of human history is our file. The strange nomination of 1939. It is not a scandal anymore. It is not an outrage. It is simply a story at rest, sleeping peacefully on its shelf. Among all the other stories, it has found its proper place. And now, just like that story, it is time for your own thoughts, your own worries of the day, to find their own shelf and to rest. Let them all rest now. The politicians and the jesters, the heroes and the villains. Let them sleep peacefully on the dusty shelves of history. Their noisy, complicated story is over, and all that is left is the deep, profound quiet of the night. A quiet for you to rest in. Let the last of your thoughts dissolve. Let the edges of the day grow soft and blurry. There is nothing to hold on to now, nothing to figure out, nothing to do but to surrender to this gentle, heavy feeling of sleep. It is time to let go of the shore of the waking world, and to drift on a slow, quiet current out into the deep, peaceful ocean of your dreams. There is only this moment, this quiet, this peace, this rest. Sleep now, sleep well, good night.